We're going to get started with Chatbook. After about 10, 15 minutes, we're going to take a short break to set up the other computer. But for now, Michael will talk about Chatbook.
All right, sweet. Is everyone able to hear me okay? In the back? Good? Sweet. All right, so we're going to get started on something called Chatbook, which will take the majority of the next few lectures. So finishing out the rest of the day and then the beginning of the day tomorrow. If you haven't met me yet, I'm Michael, and I'll be working through this workshop with Andrew, who's trying to fix some last minute bugs, but hopefully those will be resolved soon. So essentially what we will be building over the next few workshops is a type of live social media chat. And if you want to check out an example of what we'll be building, this is available at weblab.is/example. So actually this might not work right now because of the Mongo data. Oh, it does. Okay, sweet. So go ahead and check that out. And yeah, we'll just dive into it. So just to kind of reorient everyone, we've been building this website called Chatbook in this framework called React, and we can essentially model websites as a tree of components. So our root component is the app that we've been working through as part of our login and authentication lectures, and this kind of branches out into a bunch of different child components that we've built out over the past week. So this is like the feed page, the profile page, the not found page, and the nav bar that we just implemented. So over the next few workshops, we're going to be building out a new page, Chatbook, which will host that live chat feature you were just demoing. Let's kind of dive into what our front-end plan for this web page will look like. So again, we'll have a parent component for the whole entire page, which we'll call Chatbook. And this parent will divide into kind of two subcomponents. One of them on the left will be chat list, and this will hold a list of all of the users that we currently have online. And the user will be able to click on different users to kind of switch between the different chats. On the right, there'll be a chat component, which will kind of display all of the chats that we wish to show the user. And these will show messages in chronological order, as well as have a input bar at the bottom for users to send new messages. As I mentioned, each of these the chat list feature will be kind of a list of single users. So every user that's online will eventually show up on this list, and users will need to select any of those users that they want to change the active chat. This will actually be implemented tomorrow, so you don't really need to worry about this side. Today, we'll be working more on this right side, the chat component. So this will have two important child components. One of them is the single message. So you can see each of these individual messages will be represented by a single message component. And at the bottom, we'll have a new message component where users will be able to input new messages and send them to others. Kind of zooming in on how exactly we plan to design this right half chat component. Again, we'll have the app, which has the chatbook page. And from there, we'll store a state called chat data. And this chat data will essentially consist of the recipient, which is the current recipient of who we're chatting with. And it will also have an array of message objects. Each of these message objects will contain the sender, so this will be a user object, and it will also have the component or the content of the message that we wish to display to the user. Each of these user objects will have an ID that we can use to refer to it, as well as a name to kind of display to the user as a human readable format. Kind of moving towards the backend and how we plan to structure this. We'll have two main endpoints. One of them will be a get endpoint at /chat, and this will essentially be how the users can obtain all the chats that they need to be displayed on the client. Secondarily, there'll be a post endpoint at /message, which the user will use in order to send new messages to the server, and then which will then be distributed to all the clients. Of course, the server won't know how to use these endpoints without us defining them, so that will be the major work in the back end. And eventually users will be able to use these endpoints to selectively get the messages that they want, as well as send messages to specific users. So that's pretty much a very high level overview of what we aim to accomplish. I just wanted to pause here in case there was any confusion. All right, so if not, I'll hand it over to Andrew to kind of get started on the live coding workshop 8.
You can swap share.
Yeah.
Swap from you.
Yeah.
What do you want to do? It's okay. Okay, cool. So as Michael said, we're gonna be basically doing all the code that he was like outlining. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're actually going to delete the entire like folder on your laptops and reclone it. And the reason why is because we restructured the branches a little bit, and we just want to make sure that no one has any issues with like pulling random things. So the cleanest way to do this is just to delete it and reclone it. So what you can do is you can open a terminal that's like not inside of VS Code. And cd into your Chatbook React folder. And also I'll close VS Code. So once you're inside of your Chatbook React folder, what you can do is cd to the parent directory. So cd ... And then type rm-rf Chatbook React. And this will essentially like delete the entire repo off your folder. Alternatively, like if you have like Finder or something, you can also just like right click the folder and to delete it. And in order to reclone the repo, remember that the repo is available at weblab.is/catbook. So you can just git clone the same way that we did like when we initially cloned. So you can go to this like code thing, which has the URL. Some of you might be using like SSH, but it shouldn't matter. Git clone and then the URL. And then we should be able to reopen it in VS Code. So can I get like a thumbs up or something if you're able to like see Catbook React? Okay, I'll give everyone like a minute or two more. Okay, was everyone able to reclone the repo? Okay, cool. If you have any trouble, definitely like feel free to add yourself to the queue, and we can have someone help. This step is like pretty important because we want to make sure that all the branches are like synced. There's like some renaming that was going on. So definitely if you need help, add yourself to the queue. Otherwise, we'll continue with the workshop. So the branch that we'll be going on today is workshop 8. So first, run these commands, git fetch, git reset hard, and then check out the branch step 1. W8 step 1. And then because we just recloned the repo, we also want to make sure that we run npm install. And then finally, we can start our server and front end as usual with npm start and npm run hotloader. And you should be able to access Chatbook. So I guess like before I move on, does anyone have any questions or like is still like needs a bit more time to set things up? Okay, cool. So the first thing that we're gonna do for step 1 is, first of all, if you take a look at the like the nav bar, you'll notice that we have like a new chat page at the top. So right now this chat page is empty, but this is okay because this is what we're going to be implementing during this workshop. So in particular, like for the first step of the workshop, we're going to be focusing on implementing the display. So what we want to like see after this step is we want to be able to see who we're chatting with. So at the top, we'll have like a header that says we're chatting with whoever. And the way we're going to implement the actual chat is by breaking it down into a single message component and a new message component. So the single message component is going to be the component that renders like each individual message. So that will include like the sender of the message in bold and also like the message content itself. And then the new message component at the bottom of the screen is going to be where we can like enter in like, or like we can like type in our new message and then like also submit new messages. So just to like break it down a bit more in terms of like how we're actually going to implement this. So remember, like this is like, or like the red box is what we're going to be implementing today. In future workshops, we will also implement the left side of the chat bar, which will like include like a list of all of the possible recipients. But just for today, we're going to focus on just implementing like the interface itself. So inside of app.js, if we go top down, we added a new component called Chatbook. And this Chatbook is what's going to actually render the like the content. So Chatbook is going to render a chat component, and this chat component is going to be what is actually holding like the red outline box there. And then, like we just discussed, this chat component will also include 2 other components. So in particular, a single message component, which will render like an individual message. So we'll render like all the single message components inside of the chat. And then we'll also have a new message component at the bottom of the page where users can like enter new messages and like press submit. So let's also take a look at some of the props and state that we want to maintain for these like components. So inside of Chatbook, we're going to maintain a state called chat data. And chat data is essentially just going to hold like all the messages that we like currently want to render on the screen. So in particular, like messages is going to be an array of message objects where if you look at the message objects, you'll see that each message object has a sender. So that's going to be what's rendered like on the left, and also some content, which is like the message itself. And so both senders and recipients are user objects, and user objects are just objects that store like the information about each user. So that will just like have a name and also like an underscore ID. And basically the flow of information is that we're gonna set the state inside of Chatbook. So inside of the very top level component is where we're gonna like be fetching all the like the chats from the database. And we're gonna be passing down this chat data object into the chat component because we need this information to actually like render the stuff inside the chat component. And then from the chat component into the single message component, we're going to be passing down a message object because the single message component is going to be what is actually rendering like a single message. So that information is encoded inside of a message object. And then we'll also be passing down into like the new message component, we'll be just passing down the recipient. Because this is how we know like who's actually sending the message. And like also like who we're sending it to. So in terms of like how we're going to implement this, so we're actually going to go bottom up. So the first thing we're going to start with is this like new message component. And then we'll implement single message, and then we'll come together and like we'll bring them together in step 1.4 and implementing like the entire chat component. And then finally, we'll finish off in steps 1.5 and 1.6 with implementing like with putting the chat component inside of Chatbook. So this is just an overall summary of how we're going to approach this. This is definitely like seems like a lot, but we'll take this like step by step, and we'll also walk through like all the code. So to begin with, let's go into new post input.js, because this is going to be this is where our new message component is going to live. So if we look at new message, we see that we want to populate, we have some like to-dos here. So we're going to start with returning a new post input component. So if you remember from some of our previous workshops, we've actually used this component before, but just to like review a little bit, new post input is just a component that takes that has like a state, which is like the value that the user is typing at the bottom of the screen. And it also has like a submit. And this like handle submit is a prop that's passed into the new post input component. So we can essentially do, we can pass in a function that does whatever it wants when we like press the submit button. So we can take some of the syntax that was used earlier for our new message component. So for new story, it's like pretty much the same. So we can just copy. So new post input. And we want to set the default text, which is like the gray text that renders at the bottom. And we can set the default text to be like new message. And we can also pass in like the onSubmit function. So we can say send message. And we can make this send message function here. So send message will take in as input like a value, and this value is just the state that we talked about that the new post input component is maintaining. So it's just the value of the message that's being typed. And for now, what we're going to do is like it sort of shows in the demo, we're just going to console log the message. So we can console log value. In the future, this function is going to be used to like post these messages into our database. But just for this step, we just want to make sure that everything is working properly, so we can just like console log it. And then the next step is to implement the single message component. So this single message component lives in single message.js. And essentially what we want single message to look like is we want to have like a bold sender with like a colon and then also like the message itself. So what we can do is like, we have some like pre-written CSS classes provided for you. So we'll first wrap everything in like a container. So we have like uflex. So the details of like the CSS classes are not so important. This is mostly just to save time, but essentially like we want it to be like a flex container because we want to display like the author or like the sender or like the recipient of the message and also the content of the message like side by side. So it should be like a flex box. And then to display the actual sender, we can put another div with some more like pre-written classes. So this will be single message sender and also in bold. And one thing is that we want to actually show like who is the sender of this message. So if you remember, this single message component takes in as a prop a message object. So a message object is defined here. It's also defined in the code as well. But essentially the message object has a sender and the sender is a user object. The user object has a name, and this is what we ultimately want to render. So in order to render the name, we can grab our like message object prop with props.message. And then inside the message object, we want to grab the sender. And the sender is a user object. So inside the user object, we want to grab the name. So dot name. And we also want to like put the colon because it has like a colon as well. And then so right next to the sender name, we also want to put the message content itself. So this has some more like pre-written classes, single message content. And remember, we can grab the message object with props.message. And the message object also has like a key called like content. And that is where the actual content of the message will be stored. So this is pretty much it for step 1.3. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, cool. So we'll move on to step 1.4. In step 1.4, we're essentially rendering both the single message component and the new message component into like one like actual chat interface. So this chat component lives in chat.js. And essentially like chat.js is, just to reiterate one more time, we want it to look like that red box. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything inside like a container. And we have some more pre-written classes. And at the top of the container, we want to display like who we're actually chatting with. So we can put this in like a header tag, chatting with, and this like basically who we're chatting with will also be passed down to us with props. So if you look at like the diagram, we're getting the prop chat data passed down to us into chat, and chat data has a recipient as one of the fields. Recipient is a user object which has a name. So we're chatting with, to get the chat data object, we want props.data. And then chat data has a recipient, so chat.data.recipient, and then .name, because it's a user object which has like a name. And then below the h3 tag is where we want to render the actual chat itself. So we'll make like another wrapper around the whole entire chat. And what we're going to do here is notice that like we have an array of message objects that were passed to us via the chat data prop. So what we can do is we can use this array to render like an array of single message components. So we're going to do this using the .map function. So remember that props.data gets the chat data component. .messages will retrieve the array of message objects, and then .map. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to like type out the syntax, and then I'll sort of explain what's going on. So okay, so if you remember from the JavaScript lecture, the .map function essentially takes an array of things and maps it into another array of things. So in this case, our original array of things is like an array of message objects. And what we want to do is we want to take all those message objects and we want to render like a single message component. So what I'm doing here is this .map function takes in as this function, essentially M represents the actual message object and I represents like an index. And for each element in the array props that data.messages, we're rendering a single message where remember that our single message component takes in like a message as a prop. So we pass in message equals M. And you might be wondering like, what is this key prop doing here? Because it seems like inside single message, we're not actually using any like key prop. And essentially this has to do with the way that React like renders the page. So in particular, like when we have a lot of like components that are identical, such as in this scenario, we might like have a lot of messages that we're rendering. And when we render a lot of like single messages like this, basically it's like hard for React to tell them apart. So we provide like a key prop so that React like can like diff efficiently, and so it doesn't have to re-render like every single message every single time something changes. Now, if you don't like provide this key prop, like actually like everything will still render because like it will essentially like anytime there's a change, if there's no key prop, it will just re-render everything, which is just like inefficient. But you'll just get like an error in the console, like essentially like React will just like yell at you, telling you that you should provide the key prop because it makes rendering more efficient. So this is essentially the code that we use for rendering the list of single messages. And then the last part of the of our chat component is the new message at the very bottom. So we can write another wrapper. And inside we'll put a new message component. And if you remember, the new message component takes in just the recipient as props. You'll notice that we're not actually using the recipient anywhere. And that's just because we're not actually like sending any messages yet. So we don't basically we don't have a backend yet, but eventually we will be using this recipient. When we're sending messages, we want to know like who we're actually sending them to. So this is basically everything for step 1.4. You'll notice that if we go to our Chatbook and we go to the chat component, like it's still empty. And that's because even though we've coded up all these components, we're not actually rendering anything. The only thing that app.js is rendering is the Chatbook component at the very top of the tree. And we're not rendering it yet inside Chatbook. So that's what we're going to do right now for step 1.5. So the Chatbook component itself lives in chatbook.js. So we see that we have like this like array of text messages. We'll also fill up some more like mock data in a bit. But for now, we'll start by rendering the actual setting up the containers that contain the Chatbook. So we have a bit more containers. You might be wondering like why we're just like spamming containers. And like the reason why is because like right now we like all we're doing is rendering like the right side of the page, which is just the chat component. So in the future, we'll also have like the left side of the page. So that will be like a whole other component. So this container is just to hold like both of them. But since we're only rendering like one thing right now, it seems like we're just like nesting a bunch of containers, which might be like a bit redundant. But eventually we will like be populating these containers with even more code. So we'll have one more container for the actual Chatbook itself. And inside this container, we'll be rendering the chat component. So remember that our chat component takes in the chat data as props because that's how it knows what to render. So we'll do we'll create some like test data. So we'll pass in this like test data as some data. We haven't created this yet, so nothing will render. And then to create our test data, well, we'll create it at the top of the page. Remember that our test data has to be of type chat data, which has an array of message objects and also a recipient. So we can do like the recipient is something called all chat, and messages is test messages. We'll define all chat. Essentially, right now we're just gonna hard code that we're only like sending chats into like a global chat. Eventually, we will support like in the next workshop, we'll support like how to send like DMs to individual people. For now, we're just gonna only implement like a global chat though. So let's define all chat. Remember that each recipient has to have like a unique like underscore ID and also a name. So we'll say ID is like all chat, and then the name is all chat. And the test messages is already set up. Maybe just to render like a more interesting like chat, we can add another message. So each message has a sender, which is a user object. So let's say that like Michael is responding to Kenneth. And let's say he's responding to Kenneth's message with like, me too. So I'll hold all this code on the screen for like maybe 30 seconds so people can get caught up. But again, just to reemphasize, what we're doing here is we're just setting up the data that, oh, thanks. So we're just setting up the data that we would be fetching from the database. This is exactly how it would look. It's just like a bunch of like JSON objects and like arrays. But we're just like hard coding the data right now since we're not actually fetching anything from a database yet. So once we go to localhost 5050, nice, we should see that everything is showing up. Like all of our single message components are getting rendered, and also we can check the console because we said that the way that we set up this submit button is right now we're just console logging the message, so we can test like new message. When we press submit, we see that it does get console logged. So before we move on to the next step, does anyone have any questions about step one? Okay, cool. So to get caught up, you can run git reset -- hard and then git checkout workshop 8 step 2. Essentially, what we're going to be doing in step 2 is you'll notice that our inside of chatbook.js, when we're rendering the like the data, so we have like this test data here. Actually, like let's say we did want to eventually like fetch some data from the database. What we would have to do is right now it's like hard coded. So even if we got data from a database, we would have to like manually like change the code to like change like what the recipient is and what the messages is. Like it's not dynamic, and this is obviously like not what we want. So what we can do is instead of having the data be like hard coded like this, we can change the chat data that we're passing into chat into a prop inside the Chatbook component. So essentially what this will eventually look like is when the page loads, we want to fetch some data from the database. And then assuming that like this like data that we're passing into chat, the chat component is a state, then we can update the state with the data that we're fetching from the database, and then it can all like propagate downwards. So so just to reiterate one more time, what we're going to be doing in this step, or what we want to accomplish in this step, is we want to create a new state called active chat. Active chat should be in the same format as the test data that we made in step 1. So in particular, it has a recipient and also like an array of messages. At the top of the component, we still have like the dummy data that we defined earlier. And we just want to make sure the page looks exactly the same way that it did before, but that active chat is now like a state. So I'll give you guys like 3 minutes to try this on your own, and then we'll come back together and live code. Okay, so does anyone need more time to implement this step? Okay, cool. So this step is actually pretty simple. Just at the top of the component, we can define an active chat. So remember that inside of the use state hook is where we initialize like the value that we want. So we want the default recipient to be all chat, and we want the default list of messages to be test messages. And you'll notice that like this object is essentially the same that we just the same like object that we were using for our test data before. We're just initializing it to be like the same thing. And then for the data that we're passing into the chat component, we'll just pass in this like active chat. And you should see now if you log in, you should see like the chat looks exactly the same. It's just now the data that's being passed into the all chat is like the state. So it's dynamic. Okay, cool. So for step 3, oh, actually, yeah. To make sure we're all on the same page, you can run git reset -- hard, git checkout workshop 8 step 3. And the next thing we're going to do is, now that we've sort of set up all the infrastructure for rendering the actual chatbook itself, now we want to implement the API endpoints to actually start receiving messages and also like fetching them from the database when we do initially load the page. So the first thing we're going to start with is step 3.1, which is like initializing like what a message actually looks like in the database. Then in step 3.2, we'll create a post request endpoint for basically like when a user presses the submit button, they can actually like send a message to the database. And finally, in step 3.3, we'll create another endpoint to like fetch all the messages when the page initially loads. So basically, we'll start by adding a message schema that defines like what the structure of a message looks like in the database. And then we'll add like I just mentioned, a post request to post a message when a user actually presses the submit button, and it also a get request to get all the existing messages. So, well, actually, I guess we'll just live code this. So I guess we'll start in message.js for step 3.1. So I guess we kind of want to think about like what sorts of like information that we want to store for a message. So the first thing that we want to store is like a sender object. And remember that at the beginning of the workshop, we had like a bunch of like, when we defined a user object, we said that all user objects should have an underscore ID and also a name. So the sender of the message is just a user. So we also want them to have like underscore ID, which is just a string. And also a name. The next thing we want is a recipient, which is also like a user object. So this will have a string and a name, or an underscore ID, which is a string, and a name, which is also a string. And then finally, another like piece of information that we can store if we want to eventually render it is like a timestamp. Like maybe we care about when these messages are actually sent. So the way that we can initialize like a timestamp in Mongo is using like the type is like date, and we can give it a default of date.now. So essentially what this does, it allows us to like, whenever we're creating a new message object, we don't actually have to declare a timestamp. So this basically becomes like optional, because when it's passed into the database, like the default value will just be initialized as like date.now. So we don't have to worry about like creating a timestamp every time we create a new message. And then the last thing that we want to include in this message object is like the content of the message itself, which is a string. And so that is our message schema. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add a post request to post the message. Essentially, this post request will be called every time the user presses the submit button. So we can implement this in api.js. I think we'll have like a to-do here. Yeah. So step 3.2, we want to implement the post request message route. So the syntax for post request is router.post message. And in order to be able to send a message, we want to make sure that they're logged in. So we can pass in this middleware called like ensure logged in. This function is defined in the auth.js file if you want to take a look later. And then we have the rest of the syntax, which is normal. You might be wondering like, how come like we need to like run this like middleware, even though like the only way we can even access the chatbook to begin with is if we're like already authenticated. So what's the point of like running this middleware? And the reason why is because like you can always make a post request like without accessing the UI just by like typing like a URL in the or like typing a URL in like the URL of the post request. So like for example, I type in into my browser like localhost 3000 /message, and then with whatever message I want to send, then I essentially am accessing this post request without actually having to do it on the UI. So I want to make it so that like, even though you have the ability to do this, you have to like make sure that you're actually like logged in. Otherwise, like if you don't do this, then anyone who's not logged in can still post messages to your database, even if they're not doing so through the UI. But anyways, to continue with like this implementation, the first thing we can do is just like console log just for debugging. Like we received a chat message from this person, and that has this content. Sure. Yeah. So remember we talked about like earlier today, like this idea of like this rec.user object. Because we're ensuring that we're actually logged in, we know that this rec.user object exists. And then we know like we already defined that like a user object has a name. And then finally, like rec.body just accesses like the body of the post request, which we'll like construct later. But essentially we're saying that when we do make these post requests, we'll pass in like a key called like content. And then this will like display here. And then to actually save it to the database, what we have to do is we need to create a new message object. So this message object is just the same one that we just created, like the same like schema that we just created. So we want a recipient. We're assuming that we will pass the recipient into the body of our post request. And we'll also have a sender. So the person who is sending this message is the one who's like making the post request. So the ID and name can be accessed with the rec.user object. And finally, the content of the message is going to be rec.body.content. Remember that like, even though we're creating a new message object here, we do not have to declare a timestamp because we said that the timestamp has like a default value. So when we make this new message object, it will be like implicitly like initialized to whatever like date.now is. So we don't have to like explicitly declare it. But anyways, the way that we save this message in the database is with message.save. And the last thing that we have to do for this step is to implement another endpoint, which is to fetch all the chat messages when you initially load the page. So this is just going to be a GET request /chat. And then the way that we can like look for all the messages in the database is we have to like make a query. So we want to look for all messages that correspond to some recipient. So we can search for the recipient by their name or their underscore ID. For now, we're going to hard code like all chat as a recipient. Eventually, when we want to support like DMing other people, we'll pass in the recipient as like into like the GET request. And then we'll be able to like fetch all the messages for a specific recipient. But for the purpose of this workshop, we're just going to stay with like assuming that we're always messaging like the global all chat. And then the syntax for getting this query from the database is with message.find query. And this will return a list of all the messages. So we can just instantly like res.send messages. So does anyone have any questions about these two endpoints? Okay, cool. So to get caught up, you can check out step 4. So git reset hard. check out workshop 8, step 4. And this will have all the code that we just wrote. So what we want to do in step 4 is, now that we've actually set up our backend, now we want to link together both our front end and our backend. And we'll start by doing this with the send message function. So if you'll remember that in new post input.js, in the very first step of the workshop, we set up this send function, like callback function that was called every time we press the submit button. And what we did was we just console logged the value, but now we want to actually make a post request to the endpoint that we just set up /API/message. And what this will do is it will save the message into the database so that the data actually persists instead of like going away every time we refresh the page. So I'm going to give you guys some time to try to implement this yourself. But essentially, the gist is that we want to make a post request to the route /API/message with the content that we're sending. So the post request takes 2 parameters, which is the recipient, or like the person who's like receiving the intended, or like receiving the message, and also the content, which is like the actual value that was passed into like as input to the send message function. And so there are some hints here that you can use to like help you out, but I'll maybe give you like 2 or 3 minutes to try this for yourself, and then we'll come back together in live code. Okay, so does anyone need more time to implement this? All right, cool. So there's not actually that much code here. We just want to directly make the post request. So /API/message. And then the body that we're passing into the message is the recipient. So again, recipient is coming from, it's defined here is like our props. So we can just directly access this with props.recipient. And the content is passed into us into this like function, which is just like the value. And that is basically it. So if this works, we should be able to go to our Chatbook now. And remember that inside of the post request, we like console logged the recipient and also the like the content of the message in the server. So we should be able to see like if I send a new message and I go to the server, I should be able to see this message. So received a chat message from me, new message. Test. So that's good. That means it worked. And oh yeah, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, git reset hard and check out workshop 8, step 5. And we're almost done. The last thing that we want to do is you'll notice that when I'm loading my page, so we just implemented sending messages to the database, but when I reload the front end, you'll notice that the message like doesn't show up. And that's because we're not actually fetching the messages from the database right now. So what we want to do is we want to use the endpoint that we created in step 3 to actually like fetch all the messages every time we reload the page. Oh, okay. So I guess we'll just implement this together. So if you go to chatbook.js, we have this like load message history function. So inside of load message history, we essentially what we want to accomplish with this function is exactly like kind of what it like sounds like is we want to load all the messages. So the first thing we'll do is we'll make a GET request to the endpoint that we defined earlier, /API/chat. And inside the body of this GET request, we'll pass in the recipient ID that we want to get for. So again, like for now, this recipient ID is not really relevant because we're only sending messages to like all chat. But eventually, we want to pass in different recipient IDs when we're like DMing like individual users. So this is why we're doing this like this. And then remember that this get request for all the messages returns like just an object or like an array of message objects. So what we can do is we can use the active chat state that we set up earlier. Which takes in a recipient, which is an input to this function, and also the array of message objects. And finally, what we want to do is we want to call this function every time that the page loads. So we already kind of have this set up here, but inside this use effect, notice that this use effect has an empty dependency array, which means that it will all the code inside will run every time the component mounts. So for example, if you refresh the page, this code will run. And we just want to call this load message history function. And we're hard coding the recipient for now as all chat. Remember that all chat is just a user object that we had previously defined up here. So all chat is like hard coded. Eventually we can support different like fetching requests for or fetching the messages for like different users as well. So hopefully everyone had a chance to like copy this down. But if we go to the chat book now and we log in, cool. We'll see that the messages are loading. And also if we send like a new message, it shows up immediately, which is good. So if you want to see like the final product, you can reset hard and check out workshop 8 complete. And that is pretty much everything for this workshop.